Okay, and actually, welcome everyone. Um, this is the second session of Halakhah for the Ages, reading Responsa from a Bygone era with Dr. Rachel Furst. So good to have everyone with us again here at Risha. And we all already been together last week, so I will just turn this to you, Rachel. Just maybe a quick reminder first to just keep yourself muted, and then feel free to unmute when you would like to participate. Okay, Rachel?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who is rejoining us. Welcome to all the new participants. I just want to, I'm not going to obviously review all of last week's session together. I believe it should be available also for those who are joining this week, perhaps for the first time and want to catch up. You can watch the recording from last week. But just to briefly recap, this course, again, is going to be focusing on the Responsa literature. And we're going to be talking about the Responsa literature from a variety of different angles. Last week, we devoted our time together to a kind of introduction to this genre of Halakhic writing. And we spoke about the beginnings, the very earliest Responsa or evidence of a Responsa tradition. We spoke about the fact that it kind of, in a way, started in the Talmudic period itself. We have evidence certainly of scholars corresponding with one another over distances and sending one another questions and responses, but also how this genre of Halakhic writing really came onto its own and developed as a distinct genre of Halakhic writing during what's known as the Gaonic period. That is the period post the canonization, I suppose you could say, of the Babylonian Talmud from roughly the 7th century of the Common Era through around the year 1000. That's in very rough terms what the period of time that we call the Gaonic period. We saw some examples of the type of responsa that were written during the Gaonic period. We spoke a little bit about the range of topics that the Gaonim covered in their responsa, and also about how their correspondence worked over the distances and the very hierarchical nature of the Gaonic institution and the way in which the responsa really functioned as not only as a form of a halachic correspondence, but also as a medium by which the Gaonim established their centralized halachic authority during that period. Towards the very end of our session last week, we began to talk about the next period of halachic writing. That is the period of the Rishonim, the period of the halachic authorities, of the halachic scholars who flourished in the period after the Gaonic academies of Babylonia and the lands of Israel more or less ceased to function. The medieval period, from roughly the year 1000 to give or take the 16th century, the beginning of the 16th century, one of the endpoints that's often given for the period of these Rishonim, or early ones, as these medieval scholars later became known, is the writing of the Shulchan Aruch. And we'll, again, as I said last week, we'll have a little bit more to say about the whole concept of halachic periodization. But what we began to discuss last week as we shifted into focusing on the period of the Rishonim is the distinctions in the way that this literature was written and really functions both legally and otherwise during this second significant period of its existence. At the very end, again, of class last week, we spoke a little bit about the discussions among some of the early Rishonim concerning the legal weight of responsa literature in contrast to other genres of halachic writing, namely halachic codes and other forms of halachic writing. And this week, we're going to be moving really squarely into this period. This is the period that we're going to be focusing on for the remainder of our course, for the remainder of our time together. Although I do want to mention at the outset here that, of course, the Responsa literature continued to flourish and continued to function as a very significant form of halachic writing well into the modern period and really all the way up to today. And there's a lot that can be said about the shifting nature of the Responsa literature during the modern period. And I suppose along the way, I'll have some things to say about that. But because the period of the Rishonim was the period in which this literature really, really, really took off and became one of the backbones of halachic creativity, that's the period that our course is going to focus on starting today and for the remainder of this course. And I want to say here at this point one more word about the organization of the remainder of our sessions. From here on in, we are basically going to be devoting each session to a specific responsum, that is, to a specific example from the medieval responsa literature. So this will give us, we have another 8 sessions, this will give us an opportunity to really, obviously we're not going to be able to cover the entire scope of this literature, but we'll really be able to delve, I hope, deeply into some examples, both in order to, you know, to kind of to get a sense of how this literature really, really functioned, was written, worked, and its various facets, and also to, you know, I will attempt through the examples that we're going to be seeing to make some broader conclusions about the nature of this literature during the period in question and beyond. But before, so as Eva mentioned beforehand, I hope that everyone who is registered for the course did receive an email with the text that we're going to be studying today. For those who did not, it is in the chat. And that will continue to be the case through the duration of our course. I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to use momentarily. And I am always going to be sharing the text with you on screen, but I know that some people like to have the text in front of them, whether on a screen or whether in a printout, so they can make notes as we go along. So I will, my plan is, please God, to provide that text in advance of each session, as I have today. Okay, but before we get to the text for today, just a couple additional words of background. And in order to do that, I do want to share my screen for a moment with a PowerPoint. So bear with me for 1 second. Okay, hopefully you can see that now. Oops, let's just get that. Okay. So I just want to, just a quick word in continuation of what I was saying a moment ago about the geographic focus. This map we saw last week, and by the way, the reason that Barry Wimpheimer's book appears in a small image down there on the right corner is because just want to give him credit for this map, which I borrowed from his certainly highly recommended book on the Talmud. It's the biography, it's called, of the Talmud, part of the Yale series. But in any case, this map is really the map that I used last week to show you where the focus of halachic scholarship, including the writing of Responsa, was during the Gaonic period. This map holds true of the Talmudic period as well, but all the way through the Gaonic period, as we discussed last week, halachic scholarship was really focused in the East. The Gaonim, for the most part, were the inheritors, or they fashioned themselves as the inheritors of the sages of the Talmud. Their academies were focused in Babylonia for the most part, in the same cities that had Talmudic academies in them. By the end of this period, the Gaonic academies had all relocated to Baghdad, but they continued to use these names, much as the yeshiva of Mir in Jerusalem today continues to use its location in Eastern Europe as, as its point of reference. So too with the Gaonic academies. And of course, there was also a Gaonic academy in the land of Israel throughout this period. This is really where scholarship geographically, halachic scholarship, was focused throughout the Gaonic period. But by the time we get to the medieval period that we're going to be focusing on, as I said, for the remainder of the course, it's not to say that, Halakhic scholarship totally disappeared from the East. For example, you can see at the very bottom right-hand corner of this map that Fustat is marked. Fustat is Old Cairo. That was the seat of, for example, Maimonides and his tremendous scholarship, and as well as his son's tremendous scholarship. You can see Kairouan marked here and Fez. These were centers in North Africa that continued to be seats of important scholarship throughout this high medieval period. Nevertheless, really the focus of halachic scholarship, including, and for our purposes particularly, the writing of Responsa, really shifted westward and was focused in Europe for the first time. And in Europe, we can really divide halachic scholarship into these three centers that you see marked on the map in front of us. Ashkenaz in the north, Ashkenaz referring sometimes in a more focused way to the German-speaking lands, but sometimes, as in this map, also used in a broader sense to include the lands of northern France, which were culturally very connected to the German-speaking lands. Sometimes even England, which is not marked in this map, but which was a center of halachic creativity in a slightly more minor sense, but nonetheless one that counted during parts of this time period. You can see Sepharad in the south. That was really a reference to the southern part of Spain, which during this period moved from Muslim to back to Christian control. And somewhere in between Ashkenaz and Sepharad, both geographically as well as culturally and conceptually, was the third center of halachic scholarship known as Provence. And that really encompassed Provence, the political entity, as well as the other geographic areas that you see marked here. We're going to be focusing in this course mostly on Ashkenaz, but we will see a little bit from the other centers as well. As far as, I'm going to skip that map for just one moment. As far as chronology is concerned, this timeline I hope will be vaguely helpful just for locating us, at least for the meantime today. As I mentioned, the period that we're going to be, the period of the Rishonim, known as the period of the Rishonim, and the one that we're going to be focusing on for this course is the period from about 1000. Here, this particular timeline only goes up to the year 1300, but really this period would run through the beginning of the 16th century, and I'll expand the timeline as we go along. But I wanted to point out here some of the important scholars that you are probably at least vaguely familiar with and who we're going to be encountering in this course as well. On the lower half of this timeline, you can see first of all, the death of Bygone, who was the last of the major Babylonian Geonim. As I mentioned last week, he died in 1038, and that's oftentimes kind of used as a marker as far as the conclusion of the Geonic period is concerned. But what you can see on this timeline here is that he really was a contemporary of Rabbi Gershom ben Judah, otherwise known as Me'or HaGolah, or Light of the Exile, who was one of the very first major Ashkenazi Rishonim, major Ashkenazi medieval scholars that we know by name and by specific work, who died in 1040. So again, they were really rough contemporaries. You can see that this periodization is really very schematic. It obviously is not a perfect, we can never perfectly separate between these periods. But you'll notice Rabbi Gershom ben Judah, you'll notice Rashi, who died in 1105, Rabbeinu Tam, who died in 1171, and today we're actually going to be looking at a responsum that was authored by Rabbi Meir ben Baruch of Rothenburg, one of the major scholars of Ashkenaz German scholars of the late 13th century. He died in 1293. And on the bottom half of the chart, you can see, you'll notice, of course, Rif and Rambam, that is Alfasi and Maimonides, who we spoke about last week, as well as Joseph Ibn Migash, whose responsum we saw last week as well. They were some of the major Spanish scholars of this period. Okay, but as I said, we're going to already this week be delving into some of the material, and we'll have an opportunity in the context of our discussions today and for the remainder of the course to, as I said, kind of get back to some more bigger picture issues, some larger conclusions and takeaways that we can that we can learn about this literature. So today we are going to be looking at a responsum that I selected because what I'd like to focus on for today and for the coming weeks, in part, is what were the impetuses for the generation of this literature? In other words, why did scholars write responsa? I mentioned last week that responsa were mostly representative of correspondence between halachic authorities. We did see last week that some of the Geonic responsa were elicited by a community turning to a Geon with a particular question. But for the most part, that community was represented by its rabbinic head or by an important scholar in its midst. In other words, this was really a form of correspondence, not between, for the most part, not between lay people and halachic authorities, but for the most part between rabbinic scholars. And again, that's particularly true during this period of the Rishonim, during this medieval period. And it's one of the reasons that, as I mentioned last week, the responsa of this medieval period become much longer than the responsa of the Geonim and much more halachically involved, by which I mean the argumentation, the halachic give and take, the number of sources, the type of sources that are cited by the authority during this period are, for the most part, much more extensive than those that featured in the responsa of the Geonim. Part of this has to do with the fact that, again, as we discussed last week, the Geonim were, even apart from their responsa, recognized halachic authorities. During that period in time, communities from various diasporas continued to turn to the Geonim and to the Geonic academies as a source of halachic authority. During the period of the Rishonim that we're moving into now, that was no longer the case. And so the respondents, the scholars who were writing these halachic discussions, were, in a sense, they were creating their authority. They were proving their authority. They were making a name for themselves through this vehicle by means of writing these responsa. So they had to use the responsa to kind of prove their bona fides. That's one of the reasons that it took on a much more, again, a more expansive and extensive and argumentative character. They weren't heads of these recognized academies necessarily. So they didn't have this kind of stamp of communal authority behind them in the same way that the Geonim did. They also had many more sources to contend with as halachic literature, as the generations went on and as halachic literature expanded. There was a much larger library to draw from. And all of these things are what we're going to see today. But in particular today, what I want to look at is the way in which at least some responsa were created by individual Jewish courts who were contending with kind of tricky or sticky cases and weren't quite sure how to deal with the litigants who turned to them, would take the opportunity to write away to larger, to more significant and respected halachic authorities for legal opinions that they were then presumably going to use in their courtroom, in their halachic rulings on the bench. So we're really, in these cases, the responsa are really kind of a snapshot, a camera, a window into halakha in practice. We're talking about court cases that again necessitated the turning of local judges to halachic authorities. The halachic authorities would respond to them with the issuing of these responsa. Now, this raises all kinds of questions as to what exactly, as we began to discuss last week, the legal nature of these responsa were. And I'll leave that as an open question for right now. We'll return to that question. It also, Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to make sure that you saw the comment in the chat. Do you want me to read it to you or did you
No, I
see
did
it?
not. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Okay.
I have not been following the chat, but let me take a look at that.
Okay. I'm happy to also read it
Okay.
to you.
And by the way, I do want, maybe I'll use this as an opportunity, since I can't always, I'm not always able to follow the chat as I'm talking. If anyone does have a question, you're also very welcome to just unmute yourself and kind of jump in. This is meant to be interactive. So the question that I see now is whether someone is curious, Joshua is curious as to if or how the general genre of responsa shows up in Christianity and Islam. So this is a good question. I understand that the question is whether there's a legal parallel, whether there's any kinds of literature that parallels the concept of responsa in other religious traditions. You could expand that question also to ask about other legal traditions, even beyond the religious ones. There is, I would say, the concept of fatwa in the Islamic realm is probably one of the closest parallels to responsa literature, and perhaps we can come back to that at a later date. But it's a good question as far as, again, we'll talk more about the legal weight, the legal nature of these, and then we can maybe talk about the way that they some parallels in other traditions and the way that they might have functioned as well. Okay, so today, as I said, we're going to be looking at a responsum that was generated by one of these courts, local courts. And here I want to say one additional word about Jewish courts during this period. For the most part, over the course of the medieval period, Jewish communities around the globe had a significant amount of autonomy that was granted to them by the local authorities in the various geographic regions where they were located. Now, the autonomy did not mean that they had complete freedom or complete jurisdiction. It varied from place to place, the nature of their jurisdiction. But in medieval Europe, it generally meant that the Jewish community had the authority to set up their own courts. And we see this, by the way, in various privileges that were issued by local rulers for Jewish communities in the early medieval period, as these Jewish communities, again, in Northern Europe, among others, were established. Many of them received official privileges from local rulers that granted them, among other things, the right to set up their own courts and to rule, to have jurisdiction over their members in areas certainly of religious matters, as well as in areas of personal status that would pertain to marriage and divorce, inheritance, etc., and in civil matters. Local rulers and local courts generally reserved jurisdiction over what we would today call criminal matters, although the distinction between civil and criminal was not exactly precise in medieval Europe, but they generally reserved jurisdiction over high crimes, as they would have called it, for the local ruler or the local municipality later. But all other matters were really given to the Jewish community itself, and the Jewish community and the Jewish courts asserted their authority in those regards, although they did not have a lot of power of enforcement. And this becomes a big theme that we're going to see as well. But they did assert their authority over their constituents in these various civil matters. And as a result of this, the preponderance, if we were to count, I mean, again, we're talking about thousands and thousands of responsa that were written during this medieval period. But if we were to look at them and to categorize them subject-wise, we would see that a very significant majority of them fall into matters of, again, either personal status and or civil law. There were definitely responsa that pertained to religious matters, ritual matters, but the vast majority of them were really focused on civil matters. And civil matters and or, again, personal status, which would include marriage and divorce, inheritance, etc. The example we're going to see today is a good demonstration of that. In parentheses, I want to note that in the modern period, when Jewish communities, to a large extent, lost this judicial autonomy as part of the emancipation that Jewish communities went through in modern Europe. The topics of the responsa literature shifted once again. And in the modern period, we really see the preponderance of responsa in the ritual realm, because for the most part, Jewish communities did not have jurisdiction over the range of civil matters that they did during the medieval period. Okay, I do want to take a look at our text, but just before I close this PowerPoint and we delve into it, I do want to turn back to one last map. If I can just make sure okay, here we go. We are going to see that the responsum we're taking a look at today, we're going to see that somewhat unusually or somewhat distinctively for medieval responsa, the responsum we're going to be looking at today does actually provide us with definitive dating and fairly definitive geographical location. And I say that this is somewhat unusual for medieval responsa because, as we'll see throughout the course, many responsa, even if they started in the context of very specific, as I said, court cases or correspondences over very specific disputes, it was the tendency sometimes of the respondents, the correspondents themselves, and sometimes of later copyists to kind of erase the specifics, the names, the dates, in favor of referring to the various parties to these disputes as Reuben, Simeon, Sarah, Rivka, all these stock names. And we'll have more to say about why that was the case. I will note that this is, of course, rather unfortunate for historians, but of course, that was not the primary reason that these responsa were initially preserved. However, again, today we're kind of lucky. We have a medieval responsum, as we're going to see. It's from the 1270s, that was the court that wrote away to ask Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg the question that we're about to engage with. We're going to see that it was located, they locate themselves as being somewhere between Erfurt and Würzburg. And I just wanted, again, for this, so that we don't have to switch back and forth from the PowerPoint and the PDF text, I just wanted to show you here on the map exactly what we're talking about. This is a map of the medieval German Empire, more or less, around the year 1200, as you can see. The responsum that we're going to see today, as I said, is from several decades thereafter, but this map nonetheless serves our purposes. It marks some of the significant Jewish communities at the beginning of this century. There were many more by the end of the century, but Erfurt and Würzburg, as you can see here, are kind of in the middle of the German Empire as it existed during this period. Okay, so now I'm going to stop my share of this PowerPoint, and I'm going to shift now to sharing the handout that, again, you're welcome to look along on your own copy if that's helpful. Let me just get it up for you 1 second. Okay. All right. So what you can see here is that the responsum we're focusing on today is taken from Tshuvot Maimoniot. Tshuvot Maimoniot it's actually, as the name suggests, it's a collection of Ashkenazi responsa that was put together by a student of Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg, who we're going to talk about in a moment, in conjunction, or at the period of time that Maimonides' Mishneh Torah became very, very widespread in the Ashkenazi realms as well. But Maimonides, being originally Spanish and then Egyptian scholar, his halachic tradition was not always in line with the tradition of the Ashkenazim. And so one of the attempts to kind of bring Maimonides' scholarship in line with Ashkenazi tradition, or at least to allow Ashkenazim to use his book as his major code as a resource, but to appreciate where Ashkenazi scholarship and tradition diverged, was undertaken by the author of this collection, again, a major student of Meir of Rotenberg, who collected significant Ashkenazi responsa and grouped them in accordance or in conjunction with Maimonides' code. So that's just an explanation of where this comes from. This responsum appears not only in Shuvot Maimoniot, it appears in several additional collections in fairly similar form with some variations. One of those collections is the collection of the responsa of Meir of Rotenberg. And just because I always like to show books so that we're not only working from these kind of Xerox pages that are disconnected from the text. For those of you who are familiar, this is actually, I'm sorry, you can't see this because of the way my screen is right now. I'll have to provide you with a snapshot of it next week. But Rabbi Meir of Rotenberg's responsa have been collected in a variety of different editions. One of the more recent ones was undertaken by Machon Yerushalayim, and it appears in one of those collections as well. Now, this responsum is, as I said, unique for various reasons, among them, again, the specifics of the dating and the geography, but also because it opens with a court document, a document that was put together by a specific Jewish court, as well as we're about to see, in one of the later decades of the 13th century. We don't have so much material from the Jewish courts of this era, or at least incomplete material from the Jewish courts of this era. We do not have anything like organized record books put together by the courts or by the court scribes. We know that Jewish courts flourished in Ashkenaz during this period. We know a bit about the way they functioned, but we can put that information together for the most part by kind of acting as detectives, by carefully reading these responsa and piecing together the evidence that we have. And because, as I said, this is a complete court document, and it refers to additional court material, this is a particularly valuable responsa for understanding a bit about the way that the Jewish courts worked in Ashkenaz during this period. So let's take a look to see what I mean, and we'll let the text kind of speak for itself and then take a step back and try to put together the story that this text is telling us. I'm going to read it in the English translation. As you'll see at the end of my handout, I owe at least the basis of this English translation to Ephraim Shoham Steiner, an important scholar of medieval Ashkenaz, who published a few years ago an important book called Jews and Crime in Medieval Europe. And he translated this text, and this is, again, I adapted it slightly, but this is for the most part his translation. You can follow along, of course, in the original Hebrew, but let's take a look at the English. We shall pass over before. That's a quote from the Torah, from the book of Numbers, or Bimidbar. We shall pass over before our rabbi's concern about the bad deed that has been reported to us. And I already just want to clue you in. You can kind of scroll down for a moment and see at the top of page 3 that this is in fact a letter signed by 3 rabbis who were members of a Jewish court, a local Jewish court. As I said just a little bit ago, you can see on the screen in front of you, this is the very last paragraph of the letter, that they identify themselves in this very last paragraph as those close to us in Erfurt and those more remote in Würzburg, and the great luminary Rabbi Meir of Rotenberg, may the Lord guide him, and the other rabbis of the Rhineland. These are the people who they are addressing their letter to. But in addressing, and it's funny that their address comes at the end of the letter rather than at the beginning, but that's the way that they chose to structure it. But for our purposes, the reason that I'm mentioning it now is because they locate themselves as being close to Erfurt and further away from Würzburg. So if you think back to that map that we just saw beforehand, apparently this is a Jewish court in a small town probably that is not named, somewhere between Erfurt and Würzburg. So again, the center of the medieval German Empire, probably closer to Erfurt. This would locate us in the region of Thuringia for anyone who's familiar. And they're addressing it to the rabbis of those communities, as well as to Rabbi Meir of Rotenburg, who is really the heavyweight authority of the era. And they sign their names, we can already take a look at this, as Moshe Azriel ben Rabbi Eleazar Hadarshan, Eliezer the son of Yechiel of blessed memory, and Ephraim ben Yohel, may rest in Eden. We know a little bit about Moshe Azriel. We don't know too much about the other characters, but these were apparently members of that local tribunal. They were adjudicating the case that we're about to read about. And they, as we'll see, we'll explain, understand why they got a little stuck. And they needed to turn to some of their other colleagues to ask for help in ruling on this matter. But let's go back to the beginning of the Responsa, right? So they're writing this letter to ask their colleagues about the bad deed that has been reported to us. What was that bad deed? For Isaac has come to us and has shouted about his wife Sarah, that he left her in the month of Adar, in the year 5031, which is March 1271, when he traveled to a distant place in an attempt to make a profit so that he could sustain his home. He had left her empty, that is, not with a child. When he left, she was not pregnant, at least as far as he knew. And he did not return to her until he heard in the place where he was that his wife had transgressed, in the Hebrew is zanta, and had conceived in harlotry and had given birth. Now he has returned to his kingdom, right? Which this implies that maybe he was traveling somewhere outside of the German Empire. And now he is back. And he came before us, that is before this rabbinic tribunal, in the month of Av 5032, that is July 1272, right? So he was gone for a year at least, right? He left in March 1271. He came back and heard this whole story. And now he's approaching the rabbinic tribunal in July 1272, about 18 months later. So he came before us in the month of Av and found his wife here. He pleaded before us and even wished to keep us from prayer. And this is a reference, by the way, to an Ashkenazi practice. There was an opportunity in these German communities for people who wished to have a judicial hearing and couldn't quite get the rabbis to pay them the attention that they wanted. There was a tradition of using the kind of social religious pressure of stopping the prayer services, that is, going into the synagogue and yelling and screaming in the synagogue, preventing the rabbis and the whole community from conducting their religious lives according to the normal order until the rabbinic authorities or until the local court agreed to give them a proper hearing. And by the way, I keep referring to rabbinic authorities, and we do see that this was a rabbinic Beit Din, right? We read the names of the officiating scholars. This was a Beit Din that was comprised of rabbinic scholars, but I do want to note in parentheses, and we'll return to this at some point, that not all of the Batei Din or of the local Jewish courts were necessarily comprised of rabbinic scholars. Not every small community in Ashkenaz had rabbinic scholars who could serve as the judges on a Beit Din. Some of the local Batei Din were composed of lay people. Sometimes they were a mix of rabbis and lay people. But in any event, in this particular case, we know that there was a little bit of a background, that the rabbis weren't so quick to set up this tribunal or to listen to the litigant until he took the measure of stopping the services, of interrupting the tefillah, in order to get them to pay attention to his complaint. Yes, Jonathan, I see you have a
Jonathan,
question.
go
I was just gonna ask, and you may mention this, so apologies to miss you, but it seems pretty rare to have a a recording of a Beit Din, all signatories then writing to ask the question. I'm curious, like, how many of those do we have? Do they, because obviously the notion of teaching now is different, but I'm curious, how often do we get a response where it's signed by three different rabbis going to another rabbi to ask a question and get an answer?
Okay, so this is a great question, and I'm going to I don't mean to deflect the question, but I'm going to respond by saying we're going to see different different examples of this over the course of our studies together.
Right.
As I mentioned before, this is a semi-unusual responsum insofar as, again, we have all of these details about geography and individuals, but also because we have a very extensive, full, a complete letter that was sent by the rabbinic tribunal, by the Beit Din, to these rabbinic authorities, and we're going to see that Rabbi Meir of Rotenberg responded, certainly. We don't always have that. We are certainly going to see examples where the question was truncated or lost or kind of summarized by the respondent in very cursory fashion. We don't always get this lucky, but I decided to start with a good example. And so that's why we're looking at this one, which is, I will admit, somewhat unusual in that regard.
Great.
Okay, so let's go back to our narrative here. So we have this Isaac who is clearly, his question has to do with the wayward behavior of his wife. He's coming and he's complaining that he was gone for a while, and he was gone for long enough that if she had a baby, it was, as far as he was concerned, certainly not his, right? Let's pick up where we left off. So he interrupted the rabbis from their prayer until they decided to probe, investigate, and look into the matter. And we asked her, that is the wife, Sarah, about the matter, and she said, my husband left me full. In other words, my husband left me pregnant, right? This is his baby. This was his baby, is his baby, was his baby. To which he said, that is the husband, this was never true. As it is known to all, as I left town in Adar, meaning March 1271, and she delivered the next Adar, March 1272. Medievals knew, as we do, that pregnancy is normally 9 months. This is a little bit suspicious. He said, this cannot have been my baby. We, the tribunal, continue the rabbis, have sent for the people of her place of residence, Bnei Yeshuvah, to Rabbi Shealtiel and his 2 sons, and asked them to testify under penalty of cherem, and they did so, testifying under oath that she had indeed born a mamzer, that is an illegitimate child, as you will see in the letter of Rabbi Shealtiel. And apparently they must have appended the letter that they received from this individual. The signatures on the document are validated, for we have done so using reliable witnesses who know these signatures, right? They're kind of, they're trying to underscore that they followed appropriate judicial procedure in collecting the evidence. We also heard one witness who appeared before us, who testified under oath that last year on the eve of the festival of Shavuot, that's May of 1271, he went over to her house to make kiddush for her. Right? She was, again, alone. Her husband was presumably away on business. And he went to make, this member of the community went to make kiddush, and he found her in the company of disreputable Gentiles. They were playful and intimate with her, and they were embracing, and he fondled her. He left them in the house, right? That is the man who came to make kiddush, right? So he was kind of shocked maybe and walked away. We have assumed that it was around this time, that she had conceived, right? Which would kind of make sense if she gave birth March of the following year. In other words, right, they're saying we can kind of pinpoint when she got pregnant, and it was certainly not from her husband. And there are some individuals who have testified that they have seen her now, that is recently, on Purim of 5032, that is 1272, with a very bulging belly here in the town tribunal. That would have been right before she gave birth. Furthermore, before the bad rumors spread around this town, Sarah's father, now pay attention here, this is kind of shocking additional evidence, appeared before the undersigned and asked to consult us so that we should instruct him whether he may kill his daughter by drowning her in the river and ridding the world of her presence. Right, this is meant to be shocking. We asked him why he wished to do so. Right, this is the tribunal, the rabbinic tribunal, to which he replied, I have one daughter and she has become pregnant from harlotry, and she has given birth to a mamzer from a Gentile. For it has been over a year since her husband went off, and I cannot deny that she is an absolute and notorious whore. Zonag Murao Meforsemet. She has given birth to a baby girl, and she has killed the mamzer. And I fear that she will leave altogether and associate with bad company. The Hebrew is shetetze letarbut ra'ah, which can be translated in various ways. Some would translate it as we have here, to associate with bad company or to go off to bad ways. Some would associate that concept of tarbut ra'ah with idolatry. So perhaps the suggestion is that she threatened to run off and convert. In Ashkenaz, that would have been a conversion to Christianity. This in any event was her response to her father when he confronted her. So now apparently he approached these rabbis and asked if he could receive their permission to drown his daughter. Not surprisingly, the rabbi said to him, "Can you not put this matter right in any other fashion?" To which he replied, "The father, whenever I reprimand her, she threatens me that she will go and be among the Gentiles." And this is presumably the daughter speaking, "For I am not the first woman who has been bad, and she has fled the house many times, but then her mother talks her into returning, and she returns. I fear she will associate with bad company." Again, whether that's bad company or whether that's convert. "So I beseech you in every way to let me kill her." Not surprisingly, the rabbis did not grant him this permission. "We have not permitted him to do so, for as it is written in Tractate Sanhedrin, he who pursues idol worship, we do not save him from himself by killing him." In other words, even if we see somebody who is running on the way to worship idols, and again, Christianity was associated with idol worship for the most part in medieval Europe. Nonetheless, we don't try to stop somebody from committing that sin by actually killing him, according to the Gemara. So even on those grounds, we wouldn't let the father kill his daughter. Again, even presuming that she was on her way to do that. And even he who fornicates with an Aramean, and if we say that her main crime was not running off to embrace Christianity, but simply to prostitute herself, whom we know may be killed with zealots, right? We know that people who commit acts of sexual sin, the famous zealot of the Torah, Pinchas, stepped in and killed somebody for that reason. But if those zealots consult a legal authority and do not act out of pure zeal, those they consult with may not rule and sanction the zealous act. They're never going to, right? Even though we have examples, namely Pinchas, of people who have killed other individuals in order to prevent them from performing these terrible sexual sins. Nevertheless, we would never give that a person would never receive rabbinic, preemptive rabbinic permission to do that kinds of thing, and even more so in our case, right? So obviously we told the father that he's not allowed to kill his daughter in order to prevent her from behaving in this way. But nonetheless, the rabbis see the father's interaction with them as, sort of shocking as it may have been, as an additional piece of evidence for this woman's behavior that's worth reporting to Rabbi Meir and the other scholars with whom they wish to consult. And they conclude their letter by saying, "And we have sent all the rest of the evidence to Rothenburg, to the great luminary, our teacher, Rabbi Meir, may he live. And indeed, this case has become the subject of local female gossip," right? They add one more piece of information or evidence to the mix, right? They say the local women are talking about this also. And the phrase that they use is nosot v'notnot ba mozrot balevana, which is an expression taken, as you can see, are from the Mishnah of Sotah, meaning that the women speak of her as they spin at night. In other words, the women are talking about her behavior, about how she has fornicated and has blood on her hands. And we have recorded it all down as it came to pass. For they, that is the husband and maybe the father, have come before us, and we have accepted the testimonies and validated them and delved into the matter and investigated. It is therefore our opinion, again says the rabbinic tribunal, that in this case we should not say, let us help them patch it up, right? Our response to this husband and to this wayward wife is not shalom bayit, as we might say today, right? It's not to try to help them patch up their marriage. We think rather, we should assist them in severing this marital bond. But they weren't 100% sure of, or 100% confident in their instinctive response. And again, this is a case of some import insofar as any divorce case, any case in which they're going to advise divorce was considered pretty serious by a rabbinic tribunal. And also because, as we're going to see, it also has a financial component to it, because if they advise, if they allow the husband to divorce his wife, this Isaac to divorce Sarah, then the second question that's going to come up is whether she will at least receive her ketubah, her marital payments, or if she loses those also in the process. And they say, you know, our instinct is divorce, loss of payment, but now our rabbis, those close to us in Erfurt, I'm repeating the paragraph that we read beforehand, and those more remote in Würzburg, and the great luminary Rabbi Meir of Rotenburg, may the Lord guide him, and the other rabbis of the Rhineland, all of the major rabbinic centers of Ashkenaz of the period, please discharge Isaac from Sarah, a stray cow. And this is a, let's see, in the Hebrew, this is a kind of pun on the name Sarah. He calls her Para Sarah, by accepting Isaac's get that was performed in our presence. So they're asking these other rabbis to kind of lend their stamp of approval to their own decision and to validate the divorce that they allowed Isaac to issue. Now, I want to add in parentheses here that by this point in time, Rabbi Gersh, the ruling that was widely attributed to Gershom Me'or HaGolah that prevented a man from marrying more than one wife, although by Talmudic law, by biblical and Talmudic law, a man may marry more than one wife, that had already been widely accepted throughout the communities of Ashkenaz. And so the significance of, validating Isaac's divorce would also be the question of whether he was allowed to remarry. Another ruling that was attributed to Rabbi Meir that was attributed to Gershom Me'or HaGolah and very widely embraced by Ashkenaz by this point in time, also required a divorce to be accepted by the wife, right? Technically speaking, on a biblical level, a divorce must be issued by the husband of the husband's free will, but the wife is kind of a passive party. So if the husband wishes to divorce his wife and just kind of throws a divorce in front of her, then by biblical law and Talmudic law for that matter, she would be divorced. But according to another, again, very widespread, widely accepted ruling in Ashkenaz, attributed again to Gershom Me'or HaGolah, required the wife to accept the divorce. And clearly Sarah did not want to accept this divorce. So that's why this really becomes a sticking point here. That's why they're turning to these rabbinic authorities and asking for their approval for their ruling. And again, we saw their signatures before. And what we have here in the next part is the response of Mayor of Rotenburg, Meir ben Baruch. Again, we're going to encounter him, and I'll have more to say about him on another occasion. But I just do want to reiterate what I said already, which is that he was really the most significant scholar in Ashkenaz at this point in time, that is in the later decades of the 13th century, certainly until his imprisonment at the hands of the German authorities in 1286 and his death in 1293. Prior to that, he was really the heavyweight. Now, Meir, we do not have and I apologize, in the version that you have before you, you don't have any of Meir's response translated. This newer version, which I'll send out again, does have parts of his response translated, but it's only the very beginning and the very end of his response. He issues quite a lengthy response, which is mostly devoted to arguing that despite all their best attempts, the local tribunal simply did not have proper evidence at their hands, that there were many kind of problems with the various evidence that they had collected, some of it was testimony of a single witness, some of it was, as we saw Shealtiel and his sons, it was evidence from relatives, which is not normally accepted, that it was rumors circulated by women, which was not normally accepted. And all of this really, I mean, despite the fact the rabbis of the tribunal felt that it really added up to a substantive proof of this woman's misbehavior, nonetheless, Meir insisted that there were technical problems with it that did not allow, that should not allow the rabbis to force this woman to accept the divorce because of it. That being said, I do want to take a look together at Mayer's opening lines here, right, where he issues this kind of poetic opening, which is also kind of typical of many medieval responsa. How shall I open this case before you, O great ones of old, our rabbis who are laden with gold? It sounds better in the original, but you can tell that it's, kind of a bit poetic and fancy opening. Let's just skip for a moment. I have not been able to make heads or tails of this story. Right? He says there are pieces of this story that are missing. I can't quite understand what's going on here. Of the wretched woman Gomer of Divlaim. Now, the very fact that he refers to her as Gomer of Divlaim, who is, the biblical, a famous biblical wayward woman, already tells you what he thinks of her, despite the fact that he rules that they can't really force her to get divorced. Again, he issues a very long responsum, not all of which is here in the English or in the Hebrew, but he concludes his responsum with the following paragraph. You should ask her why it is that when she was asked about her pregnancy in Elul of 5031, August 1271, she denied it, and why she badmouthed those who made these allegations. Furthermore, you should delve into this matter and further probe and purge it and leave no stone unturned. In other words, you have to do a better job of collecting your evidence. But at the end of the day, if she cannot come up with a straight and logical explanation for her behavior without any legal obfuscations, then yes, you should deprive her of her marriage contract money and leave her with only the hard assets that she brought with her into her marriage. Then, in fact, she does lose her ketubah. She is divorced and she does lose her ketubah. In other words, he says to them, basically, you have to work a little bit harder at this. But there is a way to divorce this woman and to kind of deprive her of her ketubah money, which obviously would have had very serious implications for her in the process. Now, there's obviously a lot more that we could do with this responsum, a lot more to be said about it. But one of the things, as I mentioned at the beginning, that I wanted to highlight today in our examination of this particular piece was, again, the way in which responsa from this period were, at least in many cases, they were generated by a local court turning to a major halachic authority like Mayer, and presumably forwarding Mayer all of the information that they had at their disposal, explaining to Mayer exactly why, or whichever halachic authority they were turning to, exactly why they needed his help in ruling on this particular matter. And the response that Mayer issued, again, which we've seen just a little bit, but which was a very extensive, learned, lengthy response based on his close reading of the information that they had sent him, as well as the Talmudic texts that guided his halachic response. That was the responsum that would have been used by the local rabbinic court, by the rabbis who he responded to presumably guide them in their issuing of the halachic, the ultimate, the court ruling. We don't see the court ruling. As I said, we don't have all of the court records. We don't have the court notebooks, so we don't know exactly what they did with this responsum. I want to remind you that this rabbinic tribunal wrote away not only to Mayer, but to several additional halachic authorities, and they may well have gotten responsa by those authorities as well. Right? So the responsa that were generated in this way kind of functioned in the moment as, you could say, expert opinions that the court would then take and use as guidance for issuing their ruling, right? This is going to have a real life impact on Isaac, the husband, on Sarah, the woman, and on all the other parties involved. But the reason that these were preserved goes beyond, again, these were not preserved in court notebooks. We don't have anything like the original court documentation, the way that we do have, for example, in the Cairo Geniza and for various other medieval European court systems. We don't have that, unfortunately, unfortunately, I'm speaking as a historian now, for the Jewish courts of medieval Ashkenaz, the reason that these were preserved is because later halachists saw this correspondence as having legal value that went beyond the case in question. And as a matter of fact, we do see this case, this is also a bit unusual, but we do see this case cited by some later halachic authorities, which is also evidence of the fact that these responsa were collected and preserved and referred to by later scholars and authorities as a type of case law, as a type of legal precedent. And I'm going to, since our time is basically over for today, I'm going to leave you with that thought. We're going to see different types of responsa, but we're going to definitely return to that question of the circumstances in which these responsa were initially written, and how that relates to the way that they were used later on. We're also going to definitely be returning to questions of how these responsa can serve as historical sources, which I began to gesture to today, and I'll have a lot more to say in future weeks. But before we turn off, I do just want to ask if anybody has additional questions. Again, you are very welcome to, as Jonathan did, raise your hands in the middle of the session and ask. But now's a good time also if anybody has questions to jump in as well. I'll add to that if anything occurs to anybody over the course of the week, as you may perhaps continue thinking about some of this this source material, you're very welcome to either save it for next week or to write to me. I'm happy to answer any of those questions.
I had a question.
Linda, go ahead.
Yeah, what happened to her baby? Did she kill the baby? What?
Okay, excellent question. I kind of glossed over that because we were focusing on other aspects of the case. But it sounds like, right? It sounds like she did have this child. It was a girl, and at least according to her father, as reported by the rabbinic tribunal, she killed the baby. Now, we do know that infanticide was a crime that was recognized in medieval Europe, and we have other evidence from Jewish sources that Jews were not, totally immune to that, or that it didn't happen in Jewish circles. So it's possible, right? Certainly, we get the sense that there was a lot of social pressure on this woman, right? Her father was already, accusing her before the tribunal. The women of the town were gossiping about her. There were all these people who were talking about her misbehavior. And so we can imagine that the social pressure was pretty significant. She was threatening to, again, perhaps prostitute herself, perhaps go convert. There's a lot going on here. And we can imagine that in that environment, it's possible that she did try to kind of destroy the evidence of her crime by killing this child, or possibly, possibly in a more passive way, right? It didn't necessarily mean that she, how exactly the infanticide, how exactly this child died is, I think, a little bit unclear, right? The accusation comes from her father. It is interesting, though, that in this whole case, both in the question that in terms of the rabbinic tribunal's interest, and also in Meir himself, Meir never really addresses that. It seems to have been not the focus, not the interest of the rabbis. They were interested in this divorce case. They were not interested in this accusation of infanticide. Again, which I think goes back to, and I'll have much more to say about this in future weeks, about the context in which we have all of this, right? These are halachic questions that are focused on a particular halachic conundrum, and sometimes provide us evidence of other crimes and misdemeanors in a kind of by the way fashion, as in this particular case. But thank you for highlighting that. Thank you for picking up on that.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Let me see if we have any comments or questions on Facebook. No questions. Okay, Rachel, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to being together again next week. And thank you, of course, to everyone who joined us, not only here on Zoom, but also live on Facebook. Thanks for being a part of our learning community here at Drisha. Just a reminder that registration for the Spring Zman classes is open at 5784.drisha.org/spring. And more classes in this Zman are continuing tomorrow as well, including Torah and Technology, Ancient Wisdom for a Digital Age with Rabbi Daniel Nevins at 6:45 p.m. Eastern tomorrow, and Mishnah and Dat, Masechet Ketubot with Rabbanit Leah Sarna at 8 p.m. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, thank you, Rachel, and Lichtaraot next week.
Thank you.